And without further ado, Brooke Parker, you may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. And thank you for joining us for this American Rescue Plan Act listening session. My name is Brooke Parker with Deloitte, and we have been selected to work with Cobb County leaders to help identify the highest and best uses of the funds that the county is receiving from the American Rescue Plan Act. Joining me on this call today is Damon Armini, who is also part of Deloitte and will walk us through a little bit more of this presentation as we go through it. We also have several other team members that will be helping with questions and taking notes during the session. Let's transition now to the next slide and walk through what we have planned for the next 90 minutes. We will kick this off by providing an overview of the investment prioritization process, followed by an introduction into the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA, as we'll refer to it during the presentation. And finally, we'll round this out by giving you a glimpse into what activities are eligible uses under the ARPA funding. At the end of this presentation, we have left 60 minutes to address any questions or comments you may have. After this session, we would like to direct you to the Cobb County Community Needs Survey located on the Cobb County website, where you can provide your input on how the county should spend their ARPA funding. We'll provide more information on accessing the survey later in this presentation. Great. Before we get started, we are going to go over some basic Zoom webinar housekeeping items. This session is intended to educate Cobb County residents on the American Rescue Plan Act and allow community members to ask questions and share feedback with the county. This session is in no way intended to make decisions about ARPA funding or where money will be allocated, purely just to provide educational services for you and to answer any questions that you may have about eligibility. Audience questions can be received through the Q&A chat box located at the bottom of your screen. For anyone that cannot attend today's session, or maybe you have to leave early, maybe you've told a friend how great this is and you'd like them to join, this same session will take place again on November 30th. There is no need to attend both sessions unless you'd like to. This session is also being recorded and will be posted to the Cobb County ARPA website. I do want to say that audience cameras and microphones are turned off and will not be enabled during the entire session. And lastly, again, we will plug, and I will plug this throughout the entire presentation, if you would like to share your feedback on how Cobb County should be using this funding from the American Rescue Plan Act, please take the ARPA Community Needs Survey located on the Cobb County website. All right, let's start with the investment prioritization process and goals. We'd like to start this session by walking through the process of what how we're working with Cobb County in order to gather information, evaluate the data, develop criteria on which to proceed, and share recommendations to the Cobb County Board of Commissioners on prioritizing their ARPA allocations. The county is currently in the gather phase. So this is where we are gathering all kinds of information and input from viewers like you, part of the listening session, our community needs survey that I will once again mention, our focus groups, and one-on-one interviews with key Cobb County stakeholders. Once we've gathered that information, we will move on to the evaluate phase. This phase will then include all of the information that we have gathered from the stakeholder engagement and best practices and lessons learned from other county and city plans. Once we've combined those together, we will include the investment principles and criteria. Once we've created our investment criteria, we will then share that recommendation with the Board of Commissioners for review and approval. So that's just a brief overview of the process we're on. And again, we are just in the initial phase, and we're looking to use this time today to both answer questions and gather thoughts and feedback. I'm now going to hand it over to Damon, who will walk us through a few slides on the American Rescue Plan Act.
All right, so my name is Damon Armini. I am the individual that is sort of responsible for leading this project here with Cobb County and making sure that we are engaging with the community, that we are distributing information and answering questions. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about specifically the State and Local Relief Fund, but I will periodically reference other grant programs as we go. Cobb County received $147 million, half of it now, half of it later. It's part of a overall $350 billion has been distributed across the country, 8.4 billion of which went to Georgia and its counties non-entitlement units. The second tranche of funding is expected in the spring of 22. All the funding must be obligated by the end of December 2024 and must be fully expended by the end of December 2026. The allocation formula, unlike Coronavirus Relief Fund or CARES Act, is not just based on population, but also on relative unemployment and poverty levels. Next slide, please. There are several broad categories, and we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of these categories shortly, but there are several broad categories that sort of will get after what can and cannot be done with these funds. And part of the reason why we're doing these listening sessions is not just to get feedback from you and answer your questions, but to provide additional clarity, because there were a lot of reports, a lot of conversations around these big buckets that didn't necessarily go into the hundreds and hundreds of pages of regulation that have been promulgated since. So you can broadly spend it on to support public health expenditures, specifically to address COVID-19, investing in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, to provide premium pay for essential workers, to replace lost public sector revenue, and to address negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency. Next slide, please. All right, so eligible, now we're going to talk about more specifically about these different buckets. So for public health, what the federal government means are things like vaccination programs, medical expenses associated with delivering care to people who do not have insurance, testing and contact tracing, right? Essential for getting people back to work, for understanding where the virus is spreading, and enacting controls to slow the spread. Mental and behavioral health. This is a really important one. Lots and lots and lots of folks who are isolated for months from their normal interactions with civil society are struggling with mental health issues. The rule accounts for that and allows spending in that space. And then IT improvements to enhance public health programs. Now, in some cases, this can be, a big effort to bring about electronic medical records or something like that, but it's really intended more toward the discrete activities that are needed to support community health centers and things of that nature. In order for a project to be eligible, not only does it need to fit in a bucket like this, but we have to be able to measure a negative impact. We have to be able to show that something happened, right, as a function of COVID. Then we have to identify how the program, service, or activity can mitigate the impact of that and then measure it as we go. Next slide, please. Addressing negative impacts. So negative economic impacts were, you guys all saw it. I know you all did, and especially working with nonprofits, you are almost certainly encountering people who are dealing with this. This is intended to do things like aid households facing food or housing insecurity. Now, ARPA generally can be used to pay for rental assistance and things like that, but there are discrete grant programs such as ERAP2 and other things that are exclusively designed for rental assistance. What we're talking about here is oftentimes going to be things like mortgage assistance and places that are missed in the other federal grant programs. We can also provide, the rule also provides for funding to nonprofits to do things like food delivery, ensuring that the elderly, people who are unable to go out and, because of suppressed immune systems or other comorbidities, they may need help, can do that. It can provide assistance to small businesses, be it a small grant to help, renovate to deal with the specific threats COVID presents. It can be to help make rent for a small business. It can provide broad economic relief. Now, this is one of those buckets that causes people to get into trouble. They see that and they're like, this is amazing, provide economic relief. There are a lot of limits it is important that we understand that there are limits. What we mean by economic relief, we mean making sure that individuals are able to make payroll, right, after the Paycheck Protection Program expires. We mean that grants to businesses to help them just reopen their doors. How many restaurants lost all of their food when they shut down, right? Now they've got a major capital investment they're staring down to reopen. Investments in housing and neighborhoods. Now, some of this can be done This is more meaning getting after quality of neighborhoods, right? This is after things like a centralized clubhouse or something of that nature. I'm using that term because we've heard it recently, where tutors come in to deliver tutoring services to low-income communities, and making sure that that facility has broadband and computers and other things that are needed in order to do that. Because frankly, we all know that lower income individuals suffered more significantly from the effects of a shutdown, where they weren't able to go to school. Assistance to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. Now, there are specific grants for airlines, for hotels, and others. That does not mean these grants can't still come in, but because of a thing we call duplication of benefits, which means you can't pay for the same thing twice, to the extent these funds are provided, we would want to make sure that the dollars are going to something different than what may have been paid for in another grant program. Again, we have to show that there was a negative economic impact. We have to measure that. And then we have to show that the response, whatever we're doing in any of these buckets, is proportionate. Next slide, please. Examples of some of the small business and nonprofit assistance loans and grants. Maybe everyone's kind of familiar with that. Some in-kind assistance, and then technical assistance with understanding the legal obligations of responding to reporting on federal grants. I apologize to everybody here, I stuttered, so forgive me. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the one that has caught everybody's attention: premium pay to essential workers. There are a lot of technically eligible categories within this. The federal government, however, has established some pretty strict rules around how premium pay can be utilized. The intent is to focus on lower income workers, the intent of the rule. We're talking about people who got forgotten in the CARES bill or the coronavirus relief fund. So where we identified things called like hazard pay. So in this space, we're thinking about grocery store workers who were bagging groceries, stocking shelves, people who had to be at work every day. We're talking about food delivery workers. We're talking about the janitorial custodial staff who kept schools and 911 dispatch centers and everything else clean. That's the group that's focused on here. And one of the things that Treasury did is they established a series of measurements that we have to attend to before premium pay can be provided. One of those is no individual can receive more than 150% of whatever the average salary is for all jobs in a state, county, or municipality, whichever is lower. Next slide, please. There's a lot more flexibility in this rule, water, sewer, and broadband. Specifically, they would like us to focus on stormwater resilience and green infrastructure, clean water and drinking infrastructure, cybersecurity insofar as it protects the water and sewer infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, and digital literacy. So this goes to some of the conversations around ensuring that computers are available in lower income communities and things of that nature. A very quick rule of thumb is if it promotes compliance with the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act, then it's probably allowable. If it promotes resilience in the face of excessive rainfall, hurricanes, and other things, then it's probably allowable. Now, probably is an important thing here, because probably allowable doesn't mean absolutely allowable. It means that we will go into it with the expectation that whatever the program is, whatever the effort is going to be allowable, but we're still going to have to identify measurable metrics in order to demonstrate that the grant dollars are solving a known problem. And there are a few caveats around what can and cannot be done. For example, broadband infrastructure can be provided to underserved communities, but that means density, right? So if you have a community where the vast majority of people have broadband infrastructure, then we start talking about other things that we can do, such as a low-income community where the broadband is available, but no one can afford it, constructing programs to help them afford the connections, as opposed to actually stringing fiber. Next slide, please. Okay. Next steps, back to you, Brett.
Thank you, Damon. And thank you so much for presenting on that. Before we get started on the Q&A, I do want to remind everyone about our Cobb County American Rescue Plan Community Needs Survey. This is a survey we've talked about this entire presentation. It is your way to make sure that your voice is heard and provide your feedback and inputs to the county. If you're familiar with QR codes, you can go ahead and scan that code right there. If not, please go to www.cobbcounty.org/ARPA, where you can locate the survey there. The survey will be up until December 1st. All right, so let's get to some Q&A really quickly. And Damon, let's start off with probably the most basic question, which is, how much money will be allocated to small businesses or nonprofits?
Ultimately, that is at the discretion of the county council. The commissioners could allocate it all. They could allocate none of it. We will make a recommendation based on our community engagement, for example, the survey results and other things of that nature. But our job here is to advise, not to decide.
Great. And then can you talk me through how a nonprofit or private organization can receive funds? So what kind of entities or eligible uses under ARPA are really kind of their sticking points or something that are the most eligible use? Sure.
So generally, and I want to be careful here because anytime we start talking about federal grants, words like generally matter. A nonprofit organization that provides a service that is considered to be within the legal responsibility of the county government. Now, what does that mean? When you go back and you look at things like the Stafford Act and other legislation that defines how government should respond during a crisis and all the regulatory frameworks that are around that, things like food security, right? So making sure the population is fed is technically considered a legal responsibility of the county. Now, that doesn't mean that the county is responsible to ensure everybody's got food, but if somebody's going to be responsible for ensuring it happens, it's the county. So a nonprofit that does that. A nonprofit that focuses on domestic abuse survivors would be another example, specifically since we saw a huge peak or spike in domestic abuse cases during the lockdown. Or I don't want to call them lockdowns, but during the darker days of the virus. Homelessness, housing, education, base services that one thinks of in the context of what a government would typically take care of for lower income individuals.
All right, great. And then another question that we have coming in is, when can nonprofits submit a request for funding?
So right now, we would encourage you to respond to the survey so we can collect the information. Part of our job with the county is to help them design programs in accordance with how the commissioners decide to allocate these resources. So in that context, what we'll do is we'll develop programs that and then promulgate guidance to the communities and to the nonprofits or to the eligible recipients on how to apply, when to apply, and things of that nature.
Great. Will the same groups that received CARES funding get the same under this program?
It's impossible to say. So the funding is allocated differently, the rules are different. So again, the Coronavirus Relief Fund funding, or it came through CARES, was a response program. It was a lot of money really fast. The American Rescue Plan Act and the state and local fiscal recovery dollars, which specifically is what we're talking about here right now, are recovery dollars, which means you have to be much more deliberate. There's a lot more rules, it's just a bevy of regulation.
Great. We have another question from the chat, which is, what assurance will be provided to ensure that the expenditures, quote, advance racial equity?
So the best way to address that is that equity, specifically, not necessarily racial equity, is a requirement of the rule. So anytime any funds are expended, it must be tied back, except for the broadband and other things that are handled slightly differently. It must be tied back to the discussion around equity, specifically equity of access, right? So equity of access to healthcare, equity of access to food, equity and access to other education, other things in that space. I do want to point out that the rule itself, the federal government's guidelines for how this is expended, extensively about equity. Unfortunately, they never use the word racial equity.
Great. Well, please continue to submit your questions in the Q&A function. We really appreciate that. Another thing you can do is if you would like to provide us with, this is our nonprofit session. So if you'd like to provide us with what your nonprofit does, we can answer specific questions around that and potentially eligibility around your specific nonprofit, which would be great. I have one more question. How can funds be used to assist nonprofits as a response to the negative impacts of COVID-19?
So in this context, one would think of nonprofits more like a business. I recognize they're not, but how we would allocate, or how we would design a program to allocate resources would be under a construct like that. Lots of nonprofits struggle to make their own rent, utility payments, even meet the minimum requirements for keeping staff and things of that nature. Those would be the kinds of activities that would be allowable in this space.
Great. So could funding be used for capital expenses or building acquisition / renovation for something like a community center, an education hub in a low-income neighborhood?
So things get really funny when you start talking about construction. All right, so very, very generally, construction is not allowable except under very narrow circumstances. Renovation can be. So we are seeing across the country some activities involved in renovating community centers and other kinds of things of that nature, which can be allowable in some circumstances.
Right,
but I would
great.
tell you, if the county commissioners were to decide to do something like that, we would have very deliberate conversations with whichever entities are going to represent that activity about exactly what's allowable, exactly how it's got to be monitored. And again, I want to emphasize to everybody, these things have to be monitored very, very closely. So every activity has to tie to some cost.
Great. What is the timeline in terms of the commissioners making a decision on how to allocate funding? And are these allocations going to be driven by the outcomes of our survey?
Allocations will be informed by the outcomes of the survey. We expect the commission to make decisions on actual allocations in February. We'll try to get there sooner, but it is an actual requirement of the federal government that we do community outreach before funds are allocated, which is exactly what we're doing here. By the way, thank you all for attending. This is always helpful to us.
Yeah, and we really appreciate your questions. So any kind of questions you have are great. When is the last day to take the survey, Damon?
Last day of November.
Okay, great. It's actually December 1st. You get a bonus day. What about building acquisition versus construction? Can you walk us through a little bit of that?
In some cases, acquisition can be allowed. Again, it would be one of those things we have to be very, very careful with. And Dr. Williams, to your comment about the EO, you are absolutely correct. I'm not denying that. The EO cannot, in this context, cannot supersede federal regulation. We are hoping that the final rule takes into account the EO and cleans up the language so that it's a little bit easier for us to handle.
Okay. What type of data is required and for what period of time to show proof of impact from a specific program?
I mean, it depends on the program. Like if we're connecting septic systems to public water, right, to public sewer service, I mean, it's however long it takes to run the pipes. Each program as it's designed, we will work with the community and with the council to, with the commissioners to establish a timeline that is appropriate and the discrete metrics that will be measured. It's important, like in a lot of cases, the metrics will vary from program to program because we're trying to solve for different problems in each case.
What kind of grant requirements for nonprofits what are the grant requirements for nonprofits that are able to get funding? What reporting, what administrative expectations are there?
Yeah, so we will communicate to any subrecipients of these funds exactly what your reporting requirements are. The goal here is before you get your first dollar, you get a conversation with our team so you understand what is attached to that dollar in terms of reporting, because the burden on the county to the federal government is actually quite high. And so we're going to want to make sure that you, the recipient or subrecipient, understand how these funds have to be handled, how they have to be accounted for, and things of that nature.
Okay, so then in terms of reporting requirements, how would that be determined for NPOs, direct services, et cetera?
It'll vary from entity to entity.
Okay.
And the amount of money that you receive will also be a factor. So receiving $1 million is going to require more activity than receiving $1,000. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. But a lot of it comes down to what's allowable under something called a micro purchase or a small project threshold, and a bunch of other things that are will drive these decisions. You will not be given more resource. We will not necessarily come to you and say, hey, guess what? You either take it or leave it, right? We're going to work with you to try to figure out a way to account for these dollars and ensure that they are handled correctly.
All right. Will preference be given to nonprofits that have not gotten as much funding as other areas did last year?
There is no regulatory requirement for that to occur. So ultimately, it will depend on the commissioners. Okay.
And then who is responsible for documenting why certain projects were funded or chosen? Does that fall under the county or the nonprofits?
That will fall under the county.
Okay. Our school has a 501c3 nonprofit, and we would be interested in a program that provides childcare providers assistance. Would our organization be eligible for a grant?
Eligible, yes, but again, that doesn't mean that the commissioners will authorize the funding. But eligible, yes, it is an eligible expense in that context.
Great. And then, can you give an example of a transformative project?
Dr. Williams, you're asking me some really hard questions today.
That's good. Keeping David on his toes.
Keep me on my toes. So it's tough to say, really. So a transformative project in the Midwest, it could be replacing all the lead pipes, right? A transformative project in Cobb County could be ensuring that all low-income communities have access to internet. At the end of the day, the things that are transformative, this is why your survey responses are so important, why your participation in these calls are so important. Because I don't know your communities as well as you do. I just don't. I know the regulation inside and out. I understand how all of this stuff can play and all of the rule sets come together. I understand how to integrate grants and do multiple different grant streams, but you know your communities, right? That's why you're here. That's why you do the work you do. And we need to hear from you. We need to understand what you need and what you would consider to be transformative. And where we can, we will find ways to help the county align to those goals. And you got to remember, the amount of money we're talking about here, the local fiscal recovery fund, that's but one of the grant streams. It's $350 billion out of a $1.9 trillion bill. You may come to me and say, Damon, it would be huge if we could fix the streetlights in this community and clean up a park. And I could say to you, okay, that may or may not be, well, it isn't allowable under the local fiscal recovery fund. But there is another grant over here that can cover that. So let me help you apply for it. Let me help you understand what the requirements are going to be if you get that grant. And then maybe you have to work with the state to apply for it. Maybe the county has to apply for it. Maybe you can apply for it directly. It just depends, right? But part of what we're here for is to at least steer you in the right direction so you understand where you can go and get those things that you need.
Yeah, that's great. And I do want to remind people that, you can ask questions, but you can also provide any feedback or ideas. We're collecting those as well. Or you can do that with our survey, which is up right now on the screen, the QR code and the link to go to our survey. We have another question, which is who will be reviewing the applications coming in?
We will be reviewing them for compliance with whatever program, we were directed by the commission to provide.
Okay. And then can you understand the reparation in your response to the FRQ?
I don't remember using the word reparation, but I will
Yeah.
go back and find out where that word was used and I'll get that answer to you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that is it for our questions. If there are no others, I do want to leave everybody with the, once again, the link to our survey, which we encourage all of you guys to take. And, please continue to provide feedback. We've also set up an email. If you would like to email the county with your ideas or feedback or questions, that is located at arpa@cobbcounty.org.
We have another question here.
Oh yeah, it looks like we do. Are there going to be committees reviewing past compliance?
Can you expand on that for me, please, in the text box? I assume you mean, are we going to rule out nonprofits that have not previously been found in compliance with federal rules? Is that correct?
No.
No, well, I was close.
Hang on. We will hang on. Okay, you mentioned you would review in terms of compliance, but after that, who reviews? Committees, teams, et cetera, for actual funding decisions?
So ultimately, the operational decisions will be made by the commissioners. So when applications come in, we will review them for compliance with the federal rules, have conversations with potential entities about the rules, the things they'll have to do. We will present it to the commission and say, hey, this is what we recommend. And then hopefully they'll allocate it to a committee, the final decision on who will receive each grant to a separate committee group, or some entity, agency, something along those lines. But as we're seeing in some places across the country, the county councils are literally handling each individual application for funding. So all that to say, I can't actually answer it for you because I don't know yet the direction the commission is going to go.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Damon. Just looking at responses right now. Damon, are there any other things that you would like to cover?
Yeah, so tool entitled DFIT. So the DFIT tool is a way to take all federal regulation for all applicable grants and put them in one location. And no, I don't think they know what they're getting themselves into. Taking all the rule sets and putting them all in one location. So an individual, a government individual can go into the tool and they can see where all the funding is distributed across the country, across their county. They can see things like qualified census tracts and other information they need to inform their decisions.
Great. Thank you, Damon.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it looks like we have once again cleared our Q&A box. So I'll give folks another minute if they want to ask questions. Otherwise, I think we are done. Once again, I'll stress the community needs survey that is open till December 1st. We would very much appreciate your feedback in there. And if you have any other follow-up questions, please reach out to the email arpa@cobbcounty.org. Doesn't look like we're getting anything. So thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate your time.
We got the text for the response for the doctor. When they talk about reparations in this context, they're talking about reparations for the impacts of COVID-19 is what we were referring to. So in this case, places where the economy has been harmed as a function of COVID-19 or lack of education, other things like that is what we mean by that particular choice of that word.
Great, thank you for addressing that. Great, I think that is it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Again, we will have this exact session again on November 30th. If you would like to listen in again or let anybody know who was unable to attend today's session. And with that, I think we can conclude. Thank you.